Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific look at a certain car from the lineup of Gran Turismo Sport, and this time it's not a car from a recent update patch, because of course we've featured them all now from the 1.19 update. This one is taking a look a little bit further back at one of the more unique, you could even say unicorn cars in the game, the road-going homologation version of this time the Mitsubishi Evo Gr.B car. Now we've already looked at the Impreza Gr.B road car, great car in its own right, they both look fantastic. The Evo is a little bit more sharp and aggressive and angular, the Subaru is a bit rounder and softer. That's pretty much the way they've always compared. But what about this one? What is this car like? What are its pros? What are its cons? And of course, as with any of these road variants, be it the Mustang, the Alfa 4C, the Peugeot, whatever, is it worth paying the, I think it's usually 2,500 mileage points or whatever it is, there's usually a discount in the mileage exchange to actually pick up the car. Is it worth that? Well, to put it succinctly and simply, yes, it is. All of the road cars in some form or another are really good. In fact, a lot of people find them to be OP in some cases. So, in the case of something like an all-wheel drive rally car for the road, it's pretty obviously going to have some big advantages over typical road cars, just like the actual homologation Gr.B cars were in real life. Stuff like the Delta Evo, the E30 M3 for the touring car homologation, the Mercedes 190 Evo. They are great performance cars of their time, and even by today's standards, many of them are still excellent cars. Now, as far as this one goes, we're not told what the engine size is. You can safely assume it's probably around a 2 litre, just like the normal car. The category is N500 because it has 473 horsepower, which compares pretty well to the Subaru, as you would hope it would. It's also putting out 414 pound-feet of torque, so power and torque are both pretty good. Not too surprising for an Evo. The weight isn't amazing. Typically, homologation cars, in the real world at least, are pretty light. Gr.B homologation, DTM homologation, Le Mans homologation like the GT1 era. On this occasion, not so much, and that's not an uncommon thing. A lot of these ones do weigh more, around the 14 to 1500 kilo region. This one weighs 1425, and consequently the horsepower per tonne is a decent enough 332. So, kind of like decent sports car territory, like a TVR, that kind of level, maybe a bit higher, a bit lower. So for 2,500 mileage points, what kind of ability do you get? And also, what kind of racing potential does it have in terms of the classes, the tuning, the performance? Well, in terms of its raw potential, just straight out of the box, how it feels, I would say that this Evo varies wildly depending on the torque split that you choose. The active, in effect, torque split that you can actually change while you're driving it, where you can have a 30-60, or 30-70 I should say, or a 40-60, or a 50-50. It makes a huge difference on this car. Even the difference between a 40-60 split and a 30-70, you can feel a massive difference. Now the one that I'm using here is heavily tuned, it's weight dropped, power increased, around 670 horsepower, although I must admit the acceleration doesn't really feel like a car that has that much power. But be that as it may, I was running it with a 40-60 split, and when I put it down to 30-70 it was certainly easier to drift, but it was also much more inclined to actually, surprisingly, spin out, which is kind of weird given that it's still got 30% torque to the front end. So I would recommend having it at around a 40-60 area. Of course, that's also dependent on the diff and suspension settings and the tyres that you have. But in its stock form, you can tell that it's got the raw potential, for sure. Now, these all-wheel drive ones have some very specific advantages over something like the Mustang or the Corvette road car, where they are more GT3-esque machines, whereas, of course, these are rally-esque. And that is traction. Especially low-speed traction. You can put your foot down and not worry about the car spinning out or burning up its tyres or anything like that. It's controlled, it's grippy, it's very forgiving. Both this and the Subaru are extremely forgiving. They're so easy to drive because typically, of course, a sports car, as an example, with around the same kind of power would be fairly tail-happy. But with all-wheel drive, these aren't. They're very, very easy to use. When you upgrade them, I find that these are the kind of cars that don't necessarily respond that well to being tuned up. Not because they handle badly or that they're not quick, but that the category that they end up being in, for instance this one ends up in N700 in its fully tuned form, as does the Subaru, it's not that they're bad at that level, but they can definitely be beaten. Because at a certain performance level, and I'm sure you guys have noticed this with certain vehicles like the Veneno, the Veyron, certain race cars even as well, all-wheel drive has a ceiling of effectiveness. And once you go above that ceiling, in performance terms, be it road or race cars, but especially race cars, it actually becomes more of a hindrance than an aid. So for instance, if you've got something like a 1000 horsepower Le Mans prototype, you just don't need all-wheel drive. It can help out a lot for sure, but you will 9 times out of 10, at least a pro driver for instance, someone who's seasoned with that kind of car, will be able to get a better lap on most circuits with a rear-wheel drive car than an all-wheel drive. That sounds counterintuitive. You wouldn't think that that would be the case, but it often is. Because although a rear-wheel drive race car does not have the hookup of grip that an all-wheel drive car of course would have, it still ends up being quicker because you have far less understeer, you can flow through high-speed corners much more easily, typically the weight is lower, etc, etc. So these cars, I would say, are much better in, say, N400 or N300 even kind of territory, if you can even get them that low. I can't recall if you can, but at least N4 and N500 is kind of the best place, really, to have these, at least in my experience of using them in the game. They feel really good at that level. The split of the weight and the power feels appropriate, whereas with extremely high power, it starts to feel, ironically, like kind of a cumbersome car, at least on the street. And of course, being a rally car for the road, it goes without saying it's going to feel more at home on the dirt than it does on the street, and on the dirt it is fantastic. And that is where both the Subaru and this one in particular really come into their own in terms of competition, and that is that on the street, the Corvette, the Mustang, the Peugeot RCZ, the Alfa 4C, all of those street-going versions of the Group 3 cars can easily beat these in terms of high-speed tracks, like Le Mans for instance, or the Nordschleife. On more technical circuits, the all-wheel drive can make a difference, as I alluded to earlier. Lower speeds, more grip, but then off-road, well, of course, those Group 3 cars wouldn't stand a chance, and that is where these come into their own, even against other all-wheel drive road cars. These are designed to be on the dirt, they feel great on the dirt, and likewise with a rally car in essentially the same way. If you take a rally car on the tarmac, it's not that it becomes bad, but it just doesn't feel like it's supposed to be there. It can compete, but it's not its ideal scenario. Likewise with these road cars, they can compete on the tarmac. As I said, sometimes they are OP, but they're just not fully at home there. Overall though, I would definitely say that all of these cars are worth picking up in the mileage exchange if you do get the chance. And that's it for this pick, of course. I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.